All right, welcome back. So, welcome to another S5 history class. Today, we are going to talk about the agricultural revolution. Now, before this point, remember that in the previous recording, we discussed in a more general way. We gave an overview of the Industrial Revolution. We know that that happened in Britain. There was a population boom. We know why it happened in Britain because there were innovations in machinery and ways of producing goods. Um, Britain was rich in natural resources like coal and iron ore, so that's important for energy, um, coal as source of energy, and also for creating things. So machinery, basically, with the use of iron, which you can use as iron and then you can also turn into steel. And also innovation because people were encouraged to invent. And also an aspect of that was the agricultural revolution. That means that you know um, there were developments in farming in terms of method, in terms of raising animals, in terms of um, the implements, the machines that people came to use. So you might think that this is not the most interesting topic, and to a certain extent, you're right. We don't really think about agriculture, although it's very important. I mean, one of the greatest inventions of humankind, in prehistory, was the invention of agriculture. This allowed us to settle down. Before agriculture, human beings were nomads. They were hunter-gatherers. But once people figured out how you know, uh, to farm, then people settled down and they domesticated animals, and they were able to produce crops that would be enough for them to eat, and some of it they would be able to store, and then eventually the groups would turn into communities, and communities would turn into towns, and then towns would turn into cities, so you have a more complex kind of life, and thus something that you could call a civilization. And the same thing, I mean, it's a similar thing in when we talk about the agricultural revolution. Nowadays, think about it. You don't really worry about getting food, even in times of crisis like the one in which we live. It's food is easily accessible, and only 1% of the population produces actually you know produces food for the rest. So imagine that. These developments were so radical, were so impactful that we it they freed most people from being tied to the land and being occupied with the production of food. They were able to do other things thanks to the innovations that happened, in the agricultural revolution. Now, let me just very quickly recommend this website. If you want to know more, you want to read text about the agricultural revolution, you can go to that website. Now, for us to understand, what it really meant for things to happen, for things to develop in the area of agriculture, we have to understand what came first, what came before. So that what came before was the open field system. So this is basically the type of farming that people had from the Middle Ages until, you know, around mid 19th century. And even in some places in the world that's not so developed, you still have this kind of, something similar to this. What do you have here? So you have the manor, so you have the town here, and then surrounding the houses, and the buildings, you have the different fields. You have four fields, three of them active, so one, two, and three. You have this one as well, but this is the commons, remember, from your S for history. This is the commons where peasants or tenants can take their animals to graze. So that's where you brought your animals for them to eat the grass, for instance, or whatever is on the ground. So you would have three active fields, and these fields were divided into small strips, as you can see. So each strip was farmed by one particular individual, one farmer or tenant. And you would have, in the course of the year, you would have, what's this, a set of crops to grow. So for instance, you have oats here, you have wheat there, etc. And then one is always left fallow. That means you don't use it, you let it rest so that it regains nutrients. So after a year, you would be able to use that piece of land again. Okay, I hope that's clear. So this is what I just described: four large fields, one common area for animal grazing. Okay, you rotated the crops every year, but you, for the most part, you stuck to the same crops, and one field is left fallow so that it would regain, the nutrients necessary to grow crops. What were the disadvantages of the open field system? Well, you can say it's an inefficient use of it. It was an inefficient use of land. Why? Because first, throughout the year, you weren't using one particular field, you left it fallow, and you're not using, those areas of the land where the oxen turn. You had to plow, you had to turn up the soil with the use of an animal, and then when you reach the end, the animal would have to turn so that it would be able to plow another section of the field. So that part of the soil where the oxen turn, you don't use that for farming. And then also between strips. So you had parts of the land that were not used for farming while they were supposed to be used for farming. You also had weeds. There's no fencing, so weeds, that's bad grass, so that's no good. Also no fencing, so animals, if they escape, for instance, if they were left unattended, they would be able to go onto the fields and destroy your crops. And the farmers had to plant the same thing. So, you know, not a lot of imagination there, very little room for innovation. So you had the same things over and over again, very little variation. But then in the 19th century, in Britain and in England and Belgium, some innovations were introduced. So you have the four-field system, which we'll explain in a minute, enclosure, selective breeding, and new machines. What is the four-field or the Norfolk system? So this means that instead of only three, for instance, three or four fields where the open field system where you only had three or four fields and then even more limited number of crops, the four field system was developed, and the rotation of crops involved, you know, more variety in terms of the crops that were produced. So, for instance, one field could have wheat, then the next year you would have turnips, then oats or barley, and then clover, or you would just grow grass. So, this was promoted by Charles Townshend in England. Okay, here also you have a picture of clover, so that's important. I'll explain that in a minute why this particular crop is important. So, what were the innovations? So, the four field system, what were the advantages? Uh, if you had turnip and clover, turnip is very good because you could grow it in winter and it's deep rooted, so it goes deep, it can survive. It's also good for animals. So this is something that you could feed your animals. So you can always grow something on your land. Clover also is also good. We just saw that here. That's clover. These are turnips. Clover is good because you know it allows you to let the ground recover while you're using it. So and clover can also be good for animals. Animals also eat that, and it helps in the regeneration of the soil, or in the what's this lets the soil regain nutrients. And also manure, the use of manure, either green manure or animal manure. Green meaning plant manure, or animal manure. So these things help keep the soil fertile or good for farming. So no land was wasted. People were always using, all fields at the same time. So they could produce more crops. If you had more crops, then you had more things to feed your livestock or animals. And then you would have fresh meat all day. If you were using the old system, you had to kill your animals during the winter because you had nothing to feed them. And then secondly, you have the second innovation, which is enclosure. So landlords and eventually Parliament itself in England forced tenants to accept this new method called enclosure. So arable land, the fields that you saw, the different fields, and a part of the commons were brought together to form one farm. So that means there was no longer a common land where tenants could bring their animals to graze, and this meant that the different fields had to be separated by fences or hedges. Like this is shrub that can grow, you know, to a certain height so that you can keep, for instance, animals out, and you can distinguish your farm from the farm of your neighbors. Okay, so you would have something like this. You would divide the land into different farms, and this had several advantages. So it reduced weeds and diseases, so the spread of disease. Of course, if you enclosed your farm, you had to keep it clean as well, and you had hedges, and then to protect your crops. And like we said, it's more efficient, so it also increased food for the animals, for cattle especially. And because the farmers had their own fields, they were free to choose whatever methods or whatever crops uh, they wanted to grow or to use. And then this increased farm production. Some landlords became wealthier, and they could raise rent. Okay, so they could force the tenants, people who didn't have land of their own, but they were farmers. They had to pay more, to the landlord, to the owner of the land. So those were the advantages, or at the very least, the consequences of enclosure. Disadvantages, well, some of the farmers and some of the tenants, the smaller farmers, they couldn't afford ditches, hedges, and rent, so they had to sell their property. Uh, they became jobless and they had to move to cities to find work. No more commons, no more common land, so no more grazing rights for laborers with animals. And also because of new machinery, so a lot of people actually lost their jobs, so they had to move to cities, so they had to look for other forms of employment, and that usually meant work in the factories. Okay, so I hope this is clear. We'll talk about the two other innovations in the next recording.